The M1 Abrams has been touted as one of the best tanks in the world for 40 years now. It was designed all the way back in the 1970s and entered service in 1980. We've seen the M1 get a new gun, tons of modifications, new capabilities and sensors over the decades. But will the US Army really drag the basic design through decades more to come? When might we see a true successor? What will that vehicle be like? Or will the M1 be the very last main battle tank the US will produce? While the future of Abrams tank may not be clear, you can try out the present Abrams for yourself in Armored Warfare, which is sponsoring this video. Armored Warfare is a tank action free-to-play online game in which you take a role of a BMC commander, master hundreds of unique vehicles, challenge other players from all over the world in PvP or team up in story-driven PvE combat. Join now and receive 7 days of premium time and a free Type 59-2A premium main battle tank to boost your Merc career. A replacement of M1 Abrams has been a topic that's been around for some time now. Almost 20 years ago, the Future Combat Systems program was to give birth to the Abrams replacement, among other vehicles. Billions were spent, but it all got cancelled. Counter-terrorism and not large-scale wars had precedence then. But some requirements were simply too advanced for the technology of the time. The Abrams replacement, the mounted combat system, was to be transportable by a Hercules plane. It's evident the MCS was to be a radically smaller vehicle, not a true main battle tank successor to the Abrams. The idea was to have a superior gun and better sensors. The MCS was meant to hit the enemy way before being hit itself. The initial crew requirement was just 2 people, later increased to 3. Non-line-of-sight attacks of up to 5 miles away were desired. The weight kept creeping up though. Final iterations were approaching 30 tons. There hasn't been an official program to replace the Abrams ever since. Well, until the Next Generation Combat Vehicle program. That was initially started in 2017, and initially it was to give birth only to the M2 Bradley infantry fighting vehicle replacement. But soon the whole program was retooled, and now it's composed of several vehicles. Sort of like the FCS Lite, only with not as much emphasis on having as much commonality between platforms as possible. Probably the first platform to be ready will be the AMPV, the replacement for half-a-century-old M113 APC. First production vehicles are already being made. Light and medium-class robotic combat vehicles are also well into development. Prototypes are here but have to be tested. Final iterations may be fielded by the end of the decade. But it is the heavy robotic vehicle that will definitely take away part of Abrams' missions. It is envisioned to be up to 27 metric tons in weight. The desired dimensions make it clear they're basically aiming at a full tank-sized vehicle. There aren't any images of the prototypes because the heavy variant is still undecided on. The request for proposals to manufacturers is not yet defined. It's likely the heavy vehicle will not see a final prototype for at least half a decade, and that the vehicle will not get delivered to the US Army units before the mid-2030s. Yet there are some public wish lists that the US Army has mentioned. They want the weapons of the heavy RCV to be able to defeat all ground threats imaginable, meaning main battle tanks as well. They also wanted to have off-board sensors, meaning small flying drones assisting the tank. And they expect the system to be non-expendable, meaning high-tech and expensive enough not to be risked willy-nilly. The Army further said the robotic vehicle must have a resilient data link with at least half the maximum range of the vehicle's primary weapon. So while artificial intelligence will be part of the system, the autonomy requirement is secondary. There will still be human control, and not through satellite comms, but literally from soldiers in a vehicle mere miles away. It's easy to imagine the goal is to have a mix of manned future battle tanks, these robotic tanks, and possibly control vehicles in a single formation. Using the robotic wingman to manned tanks will mean that there will be fewer tanks required. All those vehicles will need defenses against small quadcopter-like drones. Initially, those will likely be simple jammers, but in the future we might even see low-power lasers. The heavy robotic vehicle will not only be required to have the same firepower as the Abrams, but should be as survivable as the Abrams. In the words of Major Corey Wallace, the Army doesn't want those robotic tanks to be neutralized by medium-caliber weapons in the battlefield, leaving the manned tanks without their wingmen. Achieving similar protection in twice as light a vehicle, even if it's unmanned, is a tall order, which is why more mature active protection systems are key. APS is basically sensors coupled with miniature projectiles, detecting and intercepting missiles and gun rounds moments before they hit. The Israeli-made trophy system is an example of that, but it's a stopgap measure until a better system is devised which can stop big-caliber gun rounds, not just missiles. It is clear the heavy robotic vehicle is at this moment expected to be part of the fleet of platforms to replace the Abrams in the future. The OMFV is the M2 Bradley replacement, so we'll skip that one. Two more systems are thus left. There is the MPFV. That one is actually quite far along in development. General Dynamics and BAE are developing the two competing proposals, and prototypes are being delivered. It is to be a 38-ton vehicle with a big gun, basically a light tank. So will it replace some of the Abrams? Possibly not. The US infantry brigades, unlike the Stryker brigades, have had no such gun platforms for a few decades now. There were no Abrams tanks there, so in a sense, the new vehicle will not be replacing any tanks. It will be an additional vehicle providing support to infantry. Using the Stryker mobile gun system is not an option. The project is mostly a failure, with production cut after 142 vehicles and active numbers falling even further. The lessons of the Stryker MGS do seem to have influenced the MPFV design. A much larger vehicle, but it is fairly simple and not cutting edge. Targeting and comm systems will be based on current Abrams systems. Each infantry brigade is planned to operate 14 such vehicles, and overall the contract is planned for 500 tanks. The goal is to have the first unit equipped as early as 2025, but that date may slip. Finally, we have that vaguely worded Decisive lethality platform. It is meant to replace whatever Abrams will be left in the 2030s or possibly 2040s, not already displaced by some of the systems mentioned so far. Other non-vehicle systems are bound to encroach on tank territory in the future as well. The DLP is just a paper project. US Army offices are doing preliminary research. Potential manufacturers are holding workshops with the Army, and they're all gathering information on what the soldiers' needs are and what they might be 10 or 20 years from now. There's a possibility nothing will come of it. Brigadier General Ross Kaufman, director of a NCGV team, has at one point said that the DLP could replace the Abrams. The Abrams may simply serve for decades more in ever newer and more capable variants until other non-tank systems chip away at its relevance. In such a version of the future, the tanks would simply grow fewer in numbers overall, until they are eventually gone, without a direct heavy vehicle with a gun replacement. That process has already been going on for decades really. Ever since the end of the Cold War, the number of tanks in the US military has been dropping faster than the number of overall troops, meaning the US Army has been getting lighter and lighter on firepower and armor, expecting to compensate for that with other non-tank systems. The US Marines have decided to gradually retire all their tanks. Approximately a fifth of the Marines' tanks will be retired throughout 2021. The US Army has not made such a decision yet. If anything, the DLP project shows they're weighing their options and considering another tank. But as General Kaufman said, the US Army doesn't want to modernize to parity with the enemy. It wants the new tank to be a leap over what Russia and China are developing right now. Furthermore, General Kaufman said the DLP is a distant future project. So the Army is clearly in no rush. There have been some images of some ideas for new tanks floated at some Army workshops, but those are almost certainly not related to final design in any way, because the final design requirement doesn't exist. Will it be unmanned or manned? A 40-ton tank or a 70-ton one? It's all up in the air. At the very earliest, some preliminary decision on which route to take is scheduled to be made in 2023. Some ideas can already be surmised though. Project Officer Kevin Fitzpatrick recently talked about developing advanced armaments and sensors which can engage targets at extended range. Those were designed to enable tank gunners to make correct firing decisions quicker, engaging faraway targets. Fitzpatrick said they anticipate gunner operations of the future system to be up to 3 times faster than on current systems. And knowing one of the key aspects of the defunct FCS project tank was non-line-of-sight fire capability, it does seem the decisive lethality part of the program's name is not an accident. Rather, it accentuates what the next tank might be all about: staying out of enemy's reach, finding and engaging the enemy first with lethal effects. Other aspects of the next tank are continuously explored in workshops, like crew size and unmanned options. With Russia going for an unmanned turret on their T-14, it's entirely plausible the US will follow suit. Indeed, there has already been such a vehicle before, an Abrams tank testbed from the 1980s. It was testing unmanned turret technologies, and it looked remarkably similar to the T-14, down to the 3-man crew compartment in the hull. Various other ideas were tested for the Abrams as well by the end of the Cold War. The component advanced technology testbed, a new lighter gun, and a heavy armored and elongated turret with an autoloader. The M1 Thumper also had a new gun, this time a 140mm one. All those ideas were ultimately discarded as there was no need for an even better tank in the 1990s and beyond. Of course, 2030 and beyond will bring a different battlefield, one where advanced Russian T-14 tanks and other vehicles may trump Abrams. Will the DLP tank have a bigger gun? It's impossible to say. Larger rounds mean either fewer of them are available, or they mean a larger, heavier vehicle. Plus, the rate of fire would suffer compared to a 120mm gun. Unmanned turret and an autoloader are more likely. Those would help hold the weight in check, while offering superb crew protection. It's impossible to say what the future will hold, but Binkov will venture a guess. The biggest improvements the next-gen US tank will have over the current one will be in connectivity, sensors and weapons. Imagine a tank that shares a synthetic image of the battlefield with hundreds of other platforms nearby, and can either scout targets for other tanks to engage it, or more often engage targets which other platforms scout from 5 or 10 miles away if needed. This pretty much does require guided missiles, or at least guided unpowered rounds fired from its main gun. Use of small aerial drones to aid the tank in recon and dock with it for recharging is also likely. Greater automation is guaranteed. Given that the MPFV light tank will be around, having another light tank is not likely. So another 60+ ton steel beast seems plausible. The second and third most probable design candidates would be a heavily armored missile arsenal vehicle with superior sensors and a heavy gun vehicle with medium armor, respectively. The only problem is, much of all that can still be achieved with further modernization of the Abrams, even for the next 20 or 30 years if needed. So whether the DLP will indeed give birth to a completely new tank is not assured. What is assured is that the US is biding its time and looking carefully at its potential enemies and what tanks and systems they are deploying, intent on trumping them once it does make a decision. And remember, Binkov may talk about hypothetical wars, but only real peace can bring us all together.